The Hearthspire's outer colonnade was 2 guards short of its formal count, and Corporal Priya Anand had clocked the gap before anyone with the rank to fix it noticed at all. 2 empty posts out of 40, on the one morning of the ordinate calendar when every post was supposed to be full. Assessment Day, the day the prefect's auditors walked the palace of a conquered world and confirmed in writing that the conquest was still holding. "Post 19 and post 26, she said into her collar mic, low enough not to carry past her own faceplate. "Empty since the change of watch. Anybody reassign them and forget to log it?" "Negative," Sergeant D. Okonkwo answered, 2 colonnades over, his voice flat with the particular calm he used when he didn't like an answer and hadn't decided yet how much to worry about it. "Nobody reassigned them. They're just empty." Priya adjusted the strap of her aid kit and kept walking her sector at the pace regulation required, unhurried, visible, reassuring to whichever camera happened to be watching. While the part of her mind the Ward Legion had spent 3 years training did the math anyway. 2 open gates in a 40-post perimeter. On the single day, every noble house on Eth sent a representative to stand in the Hearthspire's central courtyard and watch the ordinate confirm, out loud, that their world still belonged to somebody else. She was 23 years old and had been on Eth for 14 months, long enough to know that empty posts on ordinary days meant supply shortfalls and bad scheduling. Empty posts on assessment day meant somebody upstairs had decided the risk was acceptable, and nobody upstairs had bothered to ask the 24 humans standing in the gaps whether they agreed. The Hearthspire rose above the colonnade in tiers of pale gray stone quarried, according to the guidebook the Ordnate's Cultural Office had printed for incoming garrison troops, from a mountain range the Isik called the Long Silence. It had been the seat of Isik kings for 6 centuries before the Ordnate's Third Fleet had arrived, and made it the seat of an Isik queen who ruled at the Ordnate's convenience instead. The banners that hung from its high windows now were split evenly, half the old gold and green of House Calse, half the Ordnate's black and bone white. And Priya had learned, in 14 months of watching Isik faces watch those banners, that the split was not a compromise anyone on this world had chosen freely. Queen Ythera Calse crossed the courtyard at 11 bells, exactly on schedule, in the plain gray processional robe the Ordinate required for assessment day, instead of the gold her ancestors had worn for 600 years. And Priya watched her the way she watched every dignitary on a security rotation, for threat vectors, for anomalies, for anything that might turn a ceremony into an incident. The queen was younger than Priya had expected the first time she'd seen her, closer to 30 than the stern middle age the propaganda hollows implied, with the Isik's long-boned height and pale gray skin, and the kind of stillness in her face that Priya had come to recognize as armor rather than serenity. She walked with 6 of her own household guard around her, Isik soldiers in the deep green of House Calse's colors, and at her left shoulder, half a pace ahead of the rest, walked a broad, gray-bearded man the guard rosters listed as Guard Captain Asian Rawl. Priya didn't know much about Rawl beyond the rosters. She knew he'd served the Calse line for over 30 years, since before the conquest, which made him one of the very few Isik officers the Ordinate had permitted to keep both his rank and his weapon. She knew the other human squads on palace rotation called him the Old Wall behind his back, not unkindly, because he had a habit of positioning himself physically between the queen and anything that looked even slightly like a threat, including, on one memorable occasion 4 months back, a Ordinate auditor who had simply walked too fast toward her with a data slate. She knew, without ever having spoken to him, that he hated the humans on the palace rotation with a specific, controlled contempt that never once slipped into anything she could report, because reporting it would have meant explaining that she understood exactly why an Isik guard captain might hate the garrison of the empire that had put a collar on his queen's throat and called it an alliance. Earth had signed its own tributary service accord 6 years before Priya was born, In the aftermath of a war so lopsided the Ordnate's own histories devoted barely a paragraph to it, and by the time she enlisted, Ward Legion was simply what humans who wanted steady pay and Ordnate-recognized citizenship papers for their families called the only branch of service open to them. The recruiting posters back on Earth didn't say any of that plainly. They said things like asterisk service secures standing, and showed clean-jawed soldiers standing at parade rest in front of Ordnate transports, and it had taken Priya about 4 months of basic training to learn what the posters were built to make her not ask. She had enlisted at 19, the year her mother's clinic in Pune lost its Ordnate operating license over a licensing technicality that had nothing to do with the quality of care, and everything to do with a quota the regional administrator needed to hit. And the signing bonus had been the difference between her mother reopening under a different name within the year and not reopening at all. She did not think of that as a noble reason. She thought of it, most days, as simply the reason, the same unglamorous arithmetic that put most of the corporals she served with into a Ward Legion uniform in the first place. Not conviction, not love of the Ordnate, just the specific, practical math of what a family back home needed, and what a signature on a service contract could buy them. What the posters didn't say was printed instead in a classified doctrine annex she'd only seen once, over a training instructor's shoulder, in her second year, an Ordnate Strategic Assessment Office table that ranked every tribute species auxiliary forces by projected operational reliability under unsupervised conditions. A phrase that meant, translated out of the bureaucratic standard it had been written in, how likely is this species to keep following orders once nobody's watching? Humanity had scored a 61 out of 100, respectable enough to justify continued recruitment, low enough that the annex recommended human units never be trusted with independent command authority above company level, and low enough, Priya had understood reading it, that somebody in an office none of them would ever see had already decided, on behalf of every human in the Ward Legion, exactly how far their loyalty could be expected to stretch before it snapped back toward self-interest. She had not thought about that number in over a year. She thought about it now, walking her sector on assessment day with 2 empty posts on her flank, because the number was, she understood with a small, cold clarity, the actual reason the posts were empty at all. 61 out of 100 was not a score that earned a prefect's full security budget. 61 out of 100 was a score that got you counted, and then discounted, in exactly the ratio the Ordnate's actuaries had decided you were worth. It didn't stop her from doing the job. If anything, 4 years in the Legion had taught her that the surest way to answer a number like that was never to argue with the office that assigned it, but simply to keep showing up exactly the way the number said you wouldn't, because arguing bought nothing. And showing up, on a long enough timescale, was the only rebuttal that actually accumulated. Sergeant Okonkwo, walking his own Sector 2 colonnades over, had told her once, over field rations on a slow night the month before, that he'd read the same annex in his second year too, and that it had made him meaner about his job instead of softer, in a way he didn't entirely have words for and didn't especially want to examine. Somebody wrote a number that says what we'll do, he'd said, turning a ration tin over in his hands like the answer might be printed on the bottom. I'd rather they were wrong on the day it counts than right on all the days it doesn't. She hadn't known, that night, which day was going to be the one that counted. Nobody ever did until it was already happening around them. Assessment Prefect Marrow, arriving the East Gate, the comms channel reported, and Priya felt the courtyard's temperature, figurative, but real, drop by several degrees. Prefect Halden Marrow governed Eth on the Ordnate's behalf the way a landlord governs a building. He intends to sell the moment the market improves, competently, without warmth, with an eye permanently fixed on the numbers that mattered to people who weren't in the room. He was tall for a human, silver at the temples though not yet 50, and he had a way of looking at everything on Eth, the palace, the queen, the human garrison that enforced his authority, as line items in a report he was writing for someone above him whose good opinion mattered far more than anyone standing in front of him ever would. He crossed to the dais at the courtyard center without acknowledging the Queen directly, opened a slate, and began reading the assessment's formal preamble in the flat cadence of a man who had read it on 11 other conquered worlds and expected to read it on 11 more. Priya kept walking her sector. Post 19 and post 26 stayed empty. It was Warden Silas Andhra who finally asked the question out loud, 20 minutes into the ceremony, over the command channel instead of the open one. The Ward Legion Company commander on site, a broad, gray-haired man in his late 50s, who had commanded human garrison troops on 4 different tribute worlds, and had the specific weariness of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything the Ordinate did, and had not yet stopped being troubled by it. Prefect Marrow, 2 of my posts have been standing empty since 0600, and I don't have a reassignment order for either of them. Can you confirm those slots were cleared through your office? They were cleared through mine, Warden. Marrow didn't look up from his slate. The assessment security budget for this cycle didn't clear 40 full posts. I made a judgment call about which 2 mattered least. Which 2 mattered least is not a call that gets made without telling the company commander, whose people are standing the other 38, Prefect. Noted for the after-action review. Marrow's voice carried the specific patience of a man who considered the conversation already over. The Queen's own household provides an inner ring. My auditors are inside a secured perimeter. This is a ceremony, Warden, not a siege. I'd ask you to trust that I know the difference. Priya heard Andhra exhale, once, through his nose, the sound of a man deciding not to fight a battle he'd already lost on paper. Copy, Prefect. She didn't know yet that the 2 empty posts sat directly opposite the service tunnels that ran beneath the Hearthspire's eastern wing, tunnels that had been sealed since before the conquest, according to every survey the Ordinate had ever run, and that a survey run by the conquered was not necessarily a survey the conquered had any interest in making accurate. She found out 40 minutes later, when the wall beside post 19 came apart in a controlled collapse of gray stone and dust, and the first wave of the Unbound came up out of 6 centuries of tunnels the Ordinate had never bothered to actually check. The Unbound had been, before the conquest, nothing more organized than a phrase Isic children used for stubbornness, *unbound to anyone's leash, and had become, in the 11 years since the Third Fleet's arrival, a resistance movement that the Ordinate's own intelligence assessments described, with the specific condescension bureaucracies reserved for problems they've decided are beneath serious concern, as residual, fragmented, non-strategic. Priya would think, much later, about how many words the Ordinate had spent explaining why the Unbound couldn't do exactly what they were doing right now. The first explosion took post 19's collapsed wall and turned it into a breach 12 meters wide. The second, half a second behind it, hit the courtyard's eastern colonnade and threw stone splinters across 40 meters of open ground, where 200 nobles, auditors, guards, and 1 queen had been standing in orderly rows for a ceremony that assumed, with total institutional confidence, that nothing here required them to move quickly. Contact, breach at post 19, multiple hostiles. All posts converge on the Queen's position. Priya was already moving before Andhra finished the order, weapon up, aid kit swinging against her hip, running the particular geometry problem every combat medic ran automatically the instant a firefight opened. Where is the highest concentration of people? Where is the exposure? Who is closest to going down? The answer, immediately, unmistakably, was the courtyard center, where Marrow's dais had put 200 civilians in a kill box built by a ceremony none of them had chosen. The Unbound came through the breach in a disciplined rush that told Priya everything she needed to know about how long this had actually been planned. Not a riot, not an improvised strike, but a unit that had rehearsed a route through tunnels the occupying power had certified, in writing, as sealed. They wore no uniform beyond a strip of unbleached cloth knotted at the shoulder, and they carried weapons that Priya's threat recognition training flagged, with a small cold jolt, as ordnance tissue, stolen, or sold, or handed over by someone inside the supply chain who had decided the Unbound's cause was worth the risk. They didn't come for the auditors, they came for the dais. Guard Captain Rahl had the Queen moving before the second explosion finished echoing, his body already between her and the breach, his 6 household guards forming a moving wedge that cut across the courtyard's chaos, toward the hearthspire's inner doors with the kind of drilled precision that told Priya this was not the first time Rahl had run this exact evacuation in his head, even if it was the first time he'd had to run it for real. It was almost enough. It would have been enough on any other day, against any other force that hadn't spent 11 years studying exactly this evacuation route. Across the courtyard, Priya's comm channel had dissolved into overlapping fragments of a fight breaking out in half a dozen places at once. A Legion squad pinned at the west gate reporting 3 wounded, Warden Andhra diverting the palace's second response company toward the auditor's wing where a knot of unbound fighters had nearly reached Prefect Marrow's own security detail before being driven back. An unfamiliar voice calling for a medic at Post 31 that nobody had spare bodies left to send. The Unbound had not struck 1 point. They had struck 6, within the same 90 seconds, with the specific coordination of a force that had spent 11 years learning exactly how thin 38 guards could be stretched across a palace built to hold 400. Private Finn Brackett, 20 years old, 3 months into his first off-world posting, took a round through the chest defending the west gate less than a minute after the first breach opened, and died before any medic could reach him. Priya would not learn that until hours later, would not have time to grieve it until the fighting itself was over, but somewhere in the part of her mind that kept score even while the rest of her was too busy to notice, she registered his name go dark on the squad manifest scrolling across the corner of her visor, and filed it away, the way soldiers learn to file things they cannot yet afford to feel. The second wave of the Unbound came up through a smaller breach at the courtyard's north corner, a position that had no post at all, empty or otherwise, because no survey had ever flagged it as a threat, and cut the wedge's line to the inner doors before Rahl's guards had covered half the distance. Priya reached the edge of the chaos in time to see it happen, Rahl's wedge forced to peel sideways, away from the doors, toward the open colonnade instead, weapons coming up on both sides, the Queen's gray processional robe a single pale shape at the center of 6 green-uniformed bodies trying to hold a line against a force that had already proven it knew exactly where the gaps were. Legion, converge, converge. The Queen's detail is cut off from the inner doors. I need bodies at the north colonnade asterisk now. Andhra's voice had lost its flat weariness entirely. What was left underneath it was the voice of a man who had commanded soldiers in enough bad places to know, from the shape of the chaos alone, that this one was going to cost something. Priya ran toward the sound of the worst of it, the way 3 years of training had built into her spine before it had ever asked her opinion. The colonnade fighting had a shape to it that Priya recognized from every worst day of her deployment compressed into 4 minutes. Short, brutal exchanges at close range, cover measured in single columns and overturned ceremonial furniture, the specific chaos of a battle that nobody had chosen the ground for. The Unbound pressed the Queen's wedge against the colonnade's outer edge, close enough to the open courtyard that every meter of retreat cost blood, and Rahl's guards fought with the grim, economical violence of soldiers who understood exactly what losing this particular fight would mean. Priya went down behind a shattered stone bench 8 meters from the nearest engaged Legion squad and started doing the only job that had ever actually made sense to her in a firefight: finding the wounded, in the order the wounded were actually dying. The first was a Ward Legion private named Cohen, hit through the meat of the shoulder, conscious and swearing and stable enough that Priya packed the wound in under 30 seconds and moved on, because 30 seconds was all a survivable wound was worth when 3 worse ones were somewhere in the same 40 meters. The second was one of the Queen's own household guard, an Isak woman down hard behind an overturned banner stand, and Priya crossed to her without letting herself think about the fact that nothing in her contract, her training, her orders, or the Ordnate's entire 11-year occupation doctrine required her to treat an Isak soldier who wasn't even nominally under her chain of command. The guard's leg was a mess of shrapnel and torn cloth. Priya clamped the bleeder, pressed a coagulant patch over the worst of it, and kept moving, because the guard would live if the bleeding stopped and would die if Priya stayed to make sure of it personally instead of finding the next one. A round took the top of Okonkwo's shoulder plate hard enough to spin him half around 3 meters from her position, and for one heart-stopping second Priya thought she'd have to add her own sergeant to the list before she saw him catch the colonnade's edge, curse in 3 languages at once, and keep firing one-handed while he checked the graze with the other. "I'm fine, Anand, eyes front," he snapped, before she'd even opened her mouth to ask, which told her exactly how much of her face had given away the question. The Unbound's line was close enough now that she could hear individual voices calling range corrections to each other in Isak across the gap, close enough that the fight had stopped being an abstraction of cover and angles, and become the specific, immediate arithmetic of how many more seconds this position could hold before it didn't. She heard Rawl before she saw him, a bellow in Isak that needed no translation, the sound of a man throwing his body into a gap, because there was nothing else left to throw, and came around the shattered bench in time to watch him take a round meant for the Queen. It hit him high on the left side below the shoulder, and it should not, by any calculation Priya's training had ever given her, have put a man his size down. But the second round came half a second behind the first, low into the hip, and Ossian Rawl's legs simply stopped answering him, and he went down in the open 8 meters clear of the colonnade's cover, in the exact strip of exposed courtyard. The Unbound's remaining line still had a clean angle on. The Queen screamed his name, the first sound Priya had heard her make all day that wasn't measured, wasn't ceremonial, wasn't the practiced stillness of a monarch who had spent a decade learning not to let her occupiers see her react to anything. And one of the remaining household guards started to move toward him and took a round through the throat for the attempt, dropping half a meter from where he'd started. Priya watched 3 more seconds of nobody moving. She understood, in the particular cold clarity that combat sometimes gave her instead of panic, exactly why nobody was moving. The angle was bad. The exposure was total. The nearest cover on Rawl's side of the gap was the same overturned banner stand the wounded guard was already sheltering behind, 12 meters of open stone between it, and the man bleeding out in full view of an enemy line that had already demonstrated twice, in the last 90 seconds, that it could hit a moving target in that exact strip of ground. Sergeant Okonkwo's voice cut across the channel, tight and urgent. "Anand, hold position. That gap is not survivable. We wait for the line to shift." Priya was already moving. She would try, afterward, in the version of the story she'd eventually have to give to an Ordnate Inquiry Board, to explain the decision in terms that made tactical sense. The Unbound's angle would degrade as the Legion squad on her flank pushed forward. There was a 4-second window when their suppressing fire would force the enemy line's heads down. She had run the numbers. It wasn't reckless. It was calculated. None of that was true, and she knew it wasn't true even as she said it, because the truth was simpler and less defensible, and the only truth she actually had. There was a man bleeding to death in the open, and she was the closest person carrying a medkit. And every year of training the Ward Legion had put into her body had built exactly one reflex strong enough to override an order, and that reflex was go to the wounded. She went low and fast, weaving the way the training manuals said to weave, and the way every instructor she'd ever had said didn't actually help much against aimed fire, but helped against the panic fire of a line that had just watched its target start moving. And the 12 meters between the bench and Ossian Rawls' body stretched out in front of her the way distance always did under fire. Too long, elastic, every stride landing a half-second slower than her lungs wanted it to. Rounds chewed the stone to her left. One clipped the strap of her aid kit and spun her half a step off her line before she caught her balance and kept running. She heard Okonkwo's voice screaming something over the comm that she didn't have the bandwidth left to parse. Heard a Legion squad suppressing fire open up somewhere behind her, Okonkwo. She understood later, throwing every round his section had at the unbound's line the instant he realized she wasn't stopping, buying her the exact 4 seconds she claimed to have calculated, and reached Rawls' body in a controlled skid that put her knees against stone hard enough to bruise through her fatigues. He was heavier than she was by 100 pounds at least, Isic bone density running denser than human, and he was bleeding from 2 wounds that needed pressure she didn't have 4 hands to apply, and the honest tactical assessment, the one she didn't have time to make and made anyway, in the back half-second of her mind that never stopped running the numbers, was that dragging a man this size back across 12 meters of open fire was very close to impossible and extremely close to suicidal. She got her arms under him anyway. Queen Ythera Calse watched the whole thing from the recessed doorway her surviving guards had finally dragged her into, close enough to see everything and too far to change any of it. And in the 11 years since the Third Fleet had taken her father's throne and put her on it as a placeholder with a crown, she had never once felt as completely, helplessly useless as she felt in the 4 seconds it took the human medic to reach Rawls' body. She had grown up on stories about what the Ordnance soldiers were, told to her not by propaganda. The propaganda came later, after the conquest, and she had learned by 15 to discount every word of it. But by her father in the years before the Third Fleet, when the Ordnance expansion was still a rumor from worlds further out, and he'd spent long winter evenings explaining what the reports said about the species the Ordnance had most recently pressed into its service. They fight because they're ordered to, he'd told her, in the specific tone of a king filing away a threat assessment for a war he correctly guessed his daughter would live to see. A conquered species doesn't fight for the empire that conquered it. It fights because refusing costs more than fighting does. Remember that. It will matter someday to know exactly how far that kind of soldier goes and no further. She had believed him for 11 years because everything she had seen of the human garrison on Eth had confirmed it. They stood their posts. They followed their rotations. They treated her guards with the specific, correct, entirely hollow courtesy of soldiers under orders to be correct, and she had never once, in 11 years, seen one of them do anything beyond what the orders required, because doing more would have meant caring about an outcome that wasn't theirs to care about, and caring cost something that conquered soldiers, she had believed, with her father's certainty inherited whole, did not have to spend on anyone but their own. She watched the human medic go down into a skid beside Ossian Rawls' body, 12 meters of open, contested ground behind her and the same 12 meters still ahead, and get her arms under a man twice her mass who was not her queen, not her commander, not her countryman, not anyone the Ordnance had ever asked her to bleed for. That's not what obedience looks like, Ythera thought, with a clarity that cut through the noise and the smoke and the specific terror of watching Rawls' blood pool on pale stone. I know what obedience looks like. I have watched this garrison practice it for 11 years. This is not that. The medic got Rawl half upright, one of his arms slung across her shoulders, her own body angled to put as much of herself between his exposed side and the unbound's line as her frame allowed, which was, Ythera could see it even from this distance, even through smoke and fear, nowhere near enough. She was small against him, narrow-shouldered where he was built like the stone he'd guarded his whole life, and she started dragging him back toward the bench with the specific, staggering, all-or-nothing effort of someone who had made a decision, and was not going to reconsider it no matter what the next 4 seconds cost her. Halfway back, a round took her low, along the outside of her thigh. Ythera saw her stumble, saw the leg buckle and catch, saw the medic's face go white and said in the same half-second and keep moving anyway, dragging Rawls' dead weight another 2 meters. Another one, with blood now soaking through her own fatigues and no visible intention of stopping to address it. Cover, get eyes on that flank now. That was the human sergeant, Okonkwo, his voice raw with something that had gone past professional urgency into something closer to a scream. And Ythera watched a full Legion squad break cover on his order and throw itself into a suppressing line that had no tactical justification beyond keeping one corporal alive for 4 more seconds. No calculus that made sense on a prefect's budget sheet. Nothing in it but soldiers deciding, in real time under fire, that this was worth the exposure. The medic reached the bench's cover with Rawls' full weight collapsing onto the stone beside her, went down hard on her wounded leg, and Ythera watched this part twice in her memory afterward, because she could not, for a long time, quite believe she had seen it correctly the first time, did not check her own leg at all. Her hands went straight to Rawls' chest, to the wound below his shoulder, applying pressure with the flat economical motion of someone who had done this exact thing enough times that her body didn't need her mind's permission to start. Ythera did not remember deciding to move. She remembered finding herself at the doorway's edge, one of her remaining guard's hands locked hard around her arm to hold her back, watching a human soldier bleed onto the same stone as her guard captain, both of them alive because the human had chosen, with nothing to gain from the choice and everything to lose, to go and get him. The suppressing fire bought the position 4 more minutes before the Unbound's line broke contact and fell back through the north breach. Not a victory, Priya understood even through the fog of adrenaline and blood loss, but a retreat, a unit that had planned this strike with a specific window in mind, and was now abandoning it rather than risk being caught in the palace when the rest of the garrison finished converging. By the time the last Unbound fighter vanished back through the north breach, the courtyard held a count that would take the rest of the night to finalize. 6 Legion wounded, 1 Legion dead, 4 of the Queen's household guard wounded, 2 of the Queen's household guard dead. Among them the guard who had gone for Rawl first and taken a round through the throat for the attempt. A woman named Veral Asa who had served House Calse for 9 years, and whose name Ythera would insist, over the objections of an ordinate liaison who considered it an unnecessary expense, be inscribed on the same eastern colonnade wall the breach had nearly brought down. 14 unbound bodies were recovered from the courtyard and the tunnels beneath it. The rest had carried their own dead and wounded back into 6 centuries of passages the Ordnance still, even now, did not have an accurate map of. None of that arithmetic mattered yet to Priya, whose entire world in the aftermath had narrowed to the specific wet warmth of Ossian Rawls' blood between her fingers and the count of her own pulse, climbing. She kept both hands on Rawls' chest wound through all 4 of those minutes. Ignoring Okonkwo's voice in her ear demanding she let someone look at her leg, ignoring the leg itself, which had gone from a sharp burning line to a distant, floating kind of wrongness that some cold clinical part of her recognized as blood loss, starting to matter more than the wound that caused it. "Stay with me," she said to Rawl, in standard, not knowing if he understood it or cared to, his eyes half-focused on something past her shoulder, his breath coming in the shallow, wet rhythm she'd learned to fear more than any amount of visible blood. "You don't get to die on the one day I actually decided to break a direct order for somebody. That's not how this works. Stay with me." He said something back in Isic, low, fractured, that she didn't have the vocabulary to translate, and she chose, in the small mercy she had left to give, to believe it was gratitude rather than the alternative she half suspected, that even bleeding out under a human medic's hands, some part of Ossian Rawl still resented the fact that it had to be hers. Warden Andra reached them at the 4-minute mark with a full relief squad and a field stretcher, and it was only once Rahl was strapped down and moving toward the Hearthspire's medical wing, stable, alive, still breathing in that same shallow rhythm but breathing, that Priya's own leg finally announced itself with enough force that her vision grayed at the edges, and Andra had to catch her before she went down on top of the bench she'd started from. "Easy, easy, Corporal. I've got you." Andra's voice had gone gentle in the specific way command voices went gentle only after the emergency that required them to be hard was over. "You want to explain to me later exactly what part of asterisk hold position you didn't understand, or should I just write the after-action report myself and save you the trouble?" "Copy that. I'll explain it later, sir." Priya's own voice sounded distant to her, thready. "Right now I'd just like it on record that I got him back." "You got him back?" Andra pressed a compress against her thigh with hands that had clearly done this before, on worse days, for worse reasons. "Whole palace watched you get him back, Corporal. Including, if I'm reading that doorway correctly, somebody who's going to have a great deal to say about it once the adrenaline wears off." Priya followed his glance toward the recessed doorway across the courtyard, where Queen Ythera Calse stood with 2 surviving guards flanking her, no longer moving toward anyone, no longer being restrained, simply standing very still and watching the stretcher carry Asian Rahl away. And for one unguarded second before the medics blocked the sightline entirely, watching Priya instead. Priya didn't have the strength left to read whatever expression was on the Queen's face at that distance. She let her head fall back against Andra's shoulder and let the medics take over the rest of the leg. And the last coherent thought she had before the field anesthetic took hold was the small, tired, entirely practical worry that she was, in approximately 6 different ways, in an enormous amount of trouble. She woke 12 hours later in the palace's human medical annex with her leg braced, stitched, and aching in the particular deep way that meant the worst of the bleeding was over, and the recovery was going to be slow and boring instead of dangerous. And the first thing she registered, before the pain, before the antiseptic smell, before the memory of the courtyard came flooding back in pieces, was that someone was sitting in the chair beside her bed who had absolutely no business being there. Queen Ythera Calse had changed out of the ceremonial gray robe into something plainer, dark green, unadorned, the kind of garment Priya suspected the Queen wore when she wasn't being made to perform for anyone. And she sat very straight in a chair clearly built for a smaller frame, hands folded, watching the doorway rather than the bed, as if she'd been rehearsing what to do with her eyes for however long she'd been waiting. "You're awake," the Queen said in careful, formal standard, the moment Priya's eyes opened enough to register her. "I was told the sedative would hold longer. I apologize if my presence—" "No, it's—" Priya tried to sit up, discovered her leg had strong opinions about that plan, and settled for propping herself higher against the pillows instead. "It's fine, Your Majesty. I mean, I don't actually know the protocol for this. Nobody trained me for queen sitting in my hospital room." Something moved at the corner of Ythera's mouth that wasn't quite a smile, the first almost expression Priya had ever seen on her at this proximity. "Nor was I trained for the protocol of visiting one. 11 years, and this is the first time I've been inside a human medical wing on my own palace grounds. I found that I did not know whether it required permission, so I did not ask for any, on the theory that a queen who has to ask permission to sit beside the person who carried her guard captain out of open fire has already lost more than the visit was worth explaining." Priya let that settle for a moment. "How's Rahl?" "Alive." Ythera's composure cracked briefly on the word, not into tears, nothing that dramatic, but into something rower than the formal stillness she'd walked in wearing. "The Legion's own surgeons worked on him for 6 hours. He will keep the leg. He will not, they tell me, ever fully trust it again, and he will spend the next several months being extremely difficult about being told to rest, because he is the kind of man who considers his own survival a professional failure if it happened while someone else was doing the work of protecting me. She paused. He asked, before they sedated him for the surgery, whether the human corporal who pulled him out had made it. I did not have an answer yet. I have one now, and I intend to bring it to him myself, because I think it matters to him more than the surgery did. I'm glad he's going to be okay. Priya meant it plainly, without performance, and something in the flatness of her own sincerity seemed to land harder on the Queen than any more careful phrasing would have. May I ask you something, Corporal Anand? Ythera had clearly looked up her name. Priya hadn't given it. And I would ask that you answer honestly, because I have spent 11 years being given careful, correct, entirely false answers by people under this occupation's authority, and I find I no longer have patience left to receive another one, even a kind one. Ask, why did you go get him? It was, Priya understood immediately, not a question about tactics. The Queen wasn't asking about angles or cover or the 4-second window Priya had claimed, in the report she still had to write, to have calculated in advance. She was asking the actual question, the one underneath all of it, and Priya owed the 12 meters of open ground, owed Rawls' blood still half-dried under her own fingernails despite the medical staff's best efforts, an actual answer instead of a professional one. Because he was down and nobody else was moving and I had the kit. Priya said it slowly, working out the true shape of it as she spoke rather than reciting something prepared. That's the training answer, and it's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is I looked at him bleeding out in the open, and I didn't think about whose guard he was, or whose crown he served, or what my orders said about who counts as mine to save and who doesn't. I just saw somebody dying who didn't have to, if somebody moved fast enough. That's the only math I actually did, Your Majesty. Everything after that was just my legs deciding before the rest of me caught up. Ythera was quiet for a long moment, her hands still folded, her eyes fixed on some point past Priya's shoulder the way they'd been fixed past Rawls' shoulder in the courtyard. And when she spoke again, her voice had lost the last of its formal, careful edges. My father told me before the Third Fleet came that a conquered soldier fights because refusing costs more than fighting does. That obedience is the whole of what the ordinate can ever buy from a species it presses into service, not loyalty, not conviction, only the specific, hollow compliance of people protecting themselves from consequence. I believed him. I have watched this garrison for 11 years and seen nothing that contradicted him. Every human soldier on this world has done exactly what was required of them, and not one measurable degree more, and I understood that as confirmation, not as restraint. She looked at Priya directly now, and there was something raw and unresolved in her expression that no amount of formal standard could smooth over. You were not required to go get him. Your own sergeant ordered you to hold position, and you disobeyed a direct order under fire to save a man who has spent 30 years hating everything your uniform represents on my world, and you did it while carrying nothing that obligated you to. I have spent this entire day trying to find the version of my father's explanation that accounts for what I watched you do, and I cannot find it. I do not know what to do with a fact that does not fit the shape I was given. I'm sorry I broke your explanation, Your Majesty. Priya said it gently, but she meant the small, dry humor underneath it too, and something in Ythera's face eased fractionally at hearing it land. Don't be. Ythera stood, smoothing the front of her plain green garment with the automatic gesture of someone who had performed formality so long it no longer needed conscious effort to summon, even now, even here. I have hated the uniform you wear for 11 years, Corporal Anand, and I have had, until yesterday, every reason I believed I needed. I find I cannot hold that hatred with the same certainty this morning. That is not gratitude. Gratitude is a smaller thing, and I do feel it, but it is not what I came here to say. What I came to say is that I no longer know what I actually believe about your people, and I intend to find out. and I wished you to be the first to know that the finding out has begun, because you are the reason it has to." She left before Priya could find an adequate response, which was, Priya thought as the door closed, probably exactly the exit the Queen had wanted, leaving the weight of the thing sitting in the room rather than smoothing it away with a farewell neither of them had the words for yet. Sergeant Okonkwo came by an hour later, dropping into the chair Ythera had vacated with the particular heaviness of a man who had spent the last however many hours holding himself together in front of people who needed him steady, and had finally run out of people to be steady for. "You look like hell," Priya told him, which was true. His shoulder was strapped where the round had grazed it, and there was a gray exhaustion under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday morning. "Copy that right back at you." He didn't smile. He sat for a moment with his hands loose between his knees looking at the floor, and Priya recognized the shape of what he was working up to say before he said it, because she'd seen him wear that exact posture once before over a different loss, a different deployment. Finn Brackett didn't make it. West Gate inside the first minute. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it second-hand from the manifest." Priya had already suspected it, from the gap in the squad log she'd glimpsed on the corner of her visor before the anesthetic took her under, but hearing it said out loud in Okonkwo's flat, careful voice made it land differently, heavier, in the specific way that confirmed grief always weighed more than suspected grief. He was 20. He was 20, and he held a gate against 6 unbound fighters for 40 seconds by himself before anyone else reached him, and that 40 seconds is most of the reason the West approach didn't collapse before the response company arrived. Okonkwo's jaw worked. "I keep running the math on whether I could have reinforced that post sooner, and I keep getting the same answer, which is that I couldn't have. And I hate that answer. And I'm going to keep running the math anyway for about the next 6 months, because that's apparently just what this job does to a person who's been doing it long enough." "You ordered me to hold position," Priya said quietly. "I didn't. I keep running my own math on that too." "Yeah." He looked up at her, and something in his exhausted face eased, fractionally. Not approval exactly. Something more complicated than that. Closer to the specific relief of a commander who had spent a very bad night more afraid of a different outcome than the one that had actually happened. "For what it's worth, Anand, I gave that order because the numbers said crossing that gap was a good way to add your name to today's list instead of subtracting somebody else's. I was right about the numbers. I'm not sorry you ignored them." He exhaled, long and slow. "I filed the incident report an hour ago. I didn't soften the part where you disobeyed a direct order under fire. I didn't soften the part where it worked either. Command can sort out what to do with both halves of that. I just didn't want you finding out from a review board that your own sergeant tried to bury the good half to protect the bad one. That's not how I run a squad." "Thank you," Priya said, and meant it in a way that went past the words available to carry it. "Don't thank me yet. Inquiries in this legion move slow, and Marrow's office is going to want somebody's career to answer for 2 empty posts, and it's not going to be his own if he can help it." Okonkwo stood, wincing at the shoulder, and paused at the foot of her bed. "Get some rest, Corporal. Whatever's coming, it can wait for your leg to stop trying to kill you first." He left the way he'd arrived, quietly, and Priya lay back against the pillows in the sudden, unfamiliar silence of a room with no one left in it to perform steadiness for, and let herself, finally, for the first time since the breach at Post 19, feel the full weight of a 20-year-old private's name going dark on a manifest she would carry, unlogged, for the rest of her enlistment. By the second day, the story had already outrun anyone's ability to control its shape. Priya heard 3 different versions of it from 3 different ESIC medical staff before noon. In one, she had carried Rawl the full width of the courtyard under continuous fire. In another, she had done it with a shattered leg from the first round instead of the second. In a third, considerably more dramatic than anything that had actually happened, She had done it after refusing a direct order from Warden Andra himself rather than her own sergeant. She corrected none of them. She had learned, over 4 years in the Legion, that a story moving through an occupied palace at that speed belonged to the people carrying it more than it belonged to the person who'd lived it, and that trying to reclaim the accurate version was usually a losing, undignified fight. What she noticed, underneath the exaggeration, was the way the Essex staff's faces changed when they told it. A nurse who had spent 14 months treating human patients with the exact, correct, entirely closed courtesy of someone performing a job she resented, and who now lingered an extra minute at Priya's bedside asking after the leg with something that had not been there before. An elderly groundskeeper who found an excuse to walk past the medical annex's window twice in one afternoon, slowing each time, looking in without quite looking at her directly, the way people look at something they haven't yet decided whether they're allowed to be moved by. Nobody said the word grateful. Ythera hadn't used it either, in the hospital room, and Priya understood, watching it ripple outward in smaller versions across the staff who touched her recovery, that gratitude wasn't actually the thing moving through the palace at all. It was something closer to recalculation. The same slow, private arithmetic Ythera had described doing out loud, running quietly now in a dozen minds that had spent 11 years filing humans under a single, settled category, and were discovering, one retelling at a time, that the category might not hold. Prefect Halden Marrow's office occupied the Hearthspire's western tower, a floor above the Queen's own audience chamber by careful design, and he had spent the 18 hours since the attack composing, revising, and quietly discarding 4 separate versions of the after-action report he was required to file with Ordnance Central by end of cycle. The problem, which he understood with the specific clarity of a man who had built a long career on understanding exactly which problems mattered, was not the attack itself. Attacks happened. The Unbound had struck twice before in his tenure, smaller, less coordinated, and both incidents had generated reports that emphasized the Ordnance garrison's swift and effective response, which was, in the narrow technical sense, true both times and would remain true this time as well. The problem was the 2 empty posts, and the budget line that had created them, and the fact that Warden Andra had already filed his own preliminary incident log. A document Marrow did not control, because the Ward Legion's chain of command ran, on paper, independently of the civil prefecture, a jurisdictional courtesy nobody in Ordnance Central had ever expected an actual prefect to need to worry about noting. In the flat, unadorned language of a career soldier who had stopped caring about political consequences somewhere around his 40th year of service, that the security budget reduction had directly enabled the breach at Post 19. Marrow had a version of events ready that reframed the budget decision as a defensible judgment call under resource constraints beyond his control, and he had a second version ready that quietly, without ever using the word, suggested the true failure belonged to whichever survey team had certified the Eastern Service tunnels sealed 11 years ago. A team that had, conveniently, rotated off years before he'd arrived, and could absorb blame without consequence to anyone currently on world. What he did not have, and what the sudden knock at his door interrupted him in the middle of not having, was any plan at all for the fact that the Queen he governed had apparently spent her morning sitting in a human medical annex holding a conversation with the corporal who'd saved her guard captain's life, and that the story of it, Priya Anand's 12 meters of open ground, Ossian Rawls' survival, the suppressing line an entire Legion squad had thrown itself into on no order but a sergeant's raw scream, had already crossed the palace faster than any report Marrow could hope to shape ahead of it. Prefect, Warden Andra didn't wait to be invited in. He simply opened the door and stood in it, filling the frame with the particular stillness of a man who had decided, sometime in the last 18 hours, that he had nothing left to lose by being direct. I need 10 minutes. I'm drafting the incident report, Warden. If this is about the budget allocation. It's about the budget allocation. Andorra stepped in and closed the door behind him without being asked. Specifically, it's about the fact that I asked you, on the command channel in front of witnesses, to confirm those 2 posts were cleared through your office, and you confirmed it, and told me it was a judgment call about which posts mattered least. I have that exchange on the command log, time-stamped, unedited. I'd like to know what version of today's events you're planning to send Ordnance Central, because whatever it is, it needs to match a record I don't control and can't be persuaded to lose. Marrow set down his slate with the deliberate calm of a man buying himself a half-second to recalculate. I'm aware the log exists, Warden. I'm not proposing to falsify anything. The report will accurately reflect that a resource-constrained security posture was tested by an unanticipated breach, and that Ward Legion personnel responded with distinction. That's not a lie. It's an emphasis. It's an emphasis that leaves out the part where you cut a Queen's protective detail by 5% on the one day of the year. The entire nobility of this world stands in one courtyard, and then told me it was a judgment call. And I want to understand why, Prefect, because from where I was standing, that judgment call nearly got the only legitimate Isic monarch this ordinate has left dead in front of 200 witnesses. And I would very much like to believe that was incompetence and not something colder. Something in Marrow's expression closed briefly, like a door shutting on a room he had no intention of showing anyone. Careful, Warden. I've been careful for 11 years, Prefect. I have 4 humans in the medical annex tonight who weren't careful for exactly 4 seconds, and every single one of them is going to live because of it. And I find that I'm no longer especially interested in being careful on their behalf while you decide how to write a report. Andorra's voice hadn't risen, but something underneath it had gone flat and hard in a way Marrow clearly recognized, because his own posture shifted minutely into something more defensive. I've read the assessment doctrine. I know exactly how convenient it would be, for exactly the kind of prefect who measures success in tribute yields and compliance metrics. If a queen who spent 11 years being quietly, correctly difficult about every land reassignment and tax adjustment your office proposes were to simply not survive an unbound strike that nobody could reasonably have prevented. I'm not accusing you of engineering an assassination, Prefect. I don't think you're that kind of monster. I think you're the ordinary kind, the kind who does the arithmetic on a budget line, notices that a queen dying in the chaos would solve several long-standing administrative headaches, and finds that the noticing quietly makes the arithmetic a little easier to sign. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Marrow's slate, dimming on his desk, went dark entirely. I'll ask you to leave my office now, Warden, Marrow said finally, and his voice had gone very controlled, very even, the voice of a man who understood exactly how much he had just confirmed by not denying it directly. And I'll remind you that whatever preliminary log you've filed sits inside a Ward Legion channel this prefecture does not officially have access to, which means, functionally, it does not exist until someone with the authority to escalate it decides that it should. Someone already has, Prefect. Andorra didn't move toward the door. Her name is Ythera Calse, and as of this afternoon, she has a very specific, very personal reason to start asking questions about exactly whose decision left her guard captain bleeding in the open, and I don't think either of us wants to be the one explaining to Ordnance Central why the Queen herself is the one who found the log first. Queen Ythera Calse did not wait for a formal audience to be scheduled. She arrived at Prefect Marrow's tower office 4 hours after Andorra left it, without escort beyond the 2 household guards who would not leave her side again for the remainder of her reign, and she did not knock. Marrow rose from his desk with the automatic, practiced courtesy of a man who had greeted 100 formal visits from 100 tribute world dignitaries, and had never once had to greet one that arrived like this, unscheduled, unescorted by protocol, and radiating a stillness that he recognized, a half-second too late, as considerably more dangerous than anger would have been. "Your Majesty, I wasn't informed." "No," Ythera agreed, "you weren't. I find I've stopped informing this office of my movements in advance, Prefect, and I intend to keep it that way for the remainder of your tenure here, however long that turns out to be." She did not sit, though he gestured toward the chair across his desk. "I understand your office has recommended that the corporal who carried my guard captain out of open fire be reassigned to a non-sensitive posting, on the grounds that her judgment under fire represents an operational risk. I would like you to explain that recommendation to me directly, in your own words, before I decide what I intend to do about it." Marrow's expression settled into the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words, with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on getting them right. "Your Majesty, the recommendation isn't personal. It's doctrinal. A soldier who disregards a direct order, whatever the outcome, sets a precedent that undermines chain of command on every future engagement. If Corporal Anand's insubordination is rewarded rather than reviewed, the Legion risks training an entire generation of soldiers to substitute personal judgment for orders in combat, and that is a genuinely dangerous outcome, regardless of how this particular instance resolved." "That is a very careful answer, Prefect. It is also not the answer to the question I asked, which was about your office's recommendation, not about doctrine in the abstract." Ythera's voice had not risen, but something underneath it had gone hard in a way that made Marrow's practiced neutrality falter, fractionally, at the edges. "I have spent the last several days learning a great deal about how your empire actually functions beneath the language it prefers to use in front of people like me. I know now that the security budget for Assessment Day was reduced on your authority. I know that the reduction created the exact gap the Unbound exploited. I know that your office's recommendation regarding Corporal Anand was filed on the same day my own request for her commendation reached Ordnance Central, and I do not believe, Prefect, that the timing of that filing was an accident. I believe it was an attempt to muddy a record you would very much prefer stayed muddy, because a clean record makes it considerably harder to argue that the near death of a queen your empire nominally protects was anything other than the direct, foreseeable consequence of a decision you made and never disclosed." "That's a serious accusation, Your Majesty." "It is." Ythera held his gaze without blinking. "I am aware of exactly how serious it is, and I am making it anyway, because I have spent 11 years being careful with this office in ways that cost my people more than I was willing, until 3 weeks ago, to admit. I am no longer willing to be careful in that particular way. Withdraw the recommendation, Prefect, or I will ensure that every detail of the budget decision, the empty posts, and the timing of your recommendation reaches Ordnance Central through a channel considerably less controllable than your own report. I understand that channel to be the same one that already carries the chorus feed to every tribute world watching this sector. I am told it is remarkably difficult to unbroadcast something once it airs." The silence that followed was longer than the one Andorra had gotten from him that morning, and when Marrow finally spoke, something in his voice had lost the last of its administrative smoothness entirely. "I'll withdraw it," he said. "Thank you, Prefect." Ythera turned toward the door, then paused, half-turned back, and delivered the last of it without any heat at all, which somehow landed harder than heat would have. "For 11 years I believed my father's account of what your empire's soldiers actually were. I no longer believe it, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left on this throne finding out exactly how wrong he was. I would suggest you consider, in whatever posting comes next for you, whether the doctrine you've spent your career defending was ever actually true, or whether it was simply the version of the truth that was easiest for men like you to keep believing." She left without waiting for an answer, and Prefect Halden Marrow stood alone in his tower office for a long moment afterward, looking at a report He no longer had any confidence he knew how to finish writing. The formal inquiry convened on the second day, in a windowless room 3 floors below the Hearthspare's western tower that the garrison used, on ordinary weeks, for supply audits, an almost indecent speed by the standards of ordinate bureaucracy, which Priya understood, once she was carried down to it on a cot with her leg elevated, was itself a kind of message about how badly certain people wanted this settled before it could grow any larger. Warden Andhra sat at her left, present as her chain of command rather than her advocate, which the panel's presiding officer, a narrow, precise ordinate reviewer named Inquiry Officer de Savorn, human by birth but ordinate central career service through and through, the kind of officer whose loyalty had migrated entirely to the institution that had promoted her, made clear at the outset, was the only role he'd be permitted to play. Corporal Anand. Vorn didn't look up from the slate in front of her for the first several questions, reading them off in the flat cadence of someone who had run this exact procedure enough times that the words no longer required her attention. You received a direct hold order from your section sergeant during active hostile contact. You proceeded to disregard that order and cross open, exposed terrain to render aid to a non-ward, non-ordinate combatant. Is that an accurate summary? It's accurate, ma'am. The Ward Legion training doctrine you signed for on enlistment includes a specific clause, Section 4, Paragraph 9, regarding unauthorized exposure to hostile fire in defense of non-priority personnel. Were you aware of that clause at the time of your decision? I was aware of it before I enlisted, ma'am. I didn't think about it during the 4 seconds. I had to decide whether Guard Captain Rawl was going to bleed out in the open. Something almost like a reaction crossed Vorn's face. Not sympathy, Priya understood immediately, but the flicker of an officer recalculating how difficult this particular interview was going to be. The Legion's own strategic assessment doctrine rates human auxiliary reliability at 61 out of 100 under unsupervised conditions, Corporal. That rating exists, in part, precisely to model situations like this one, moments where a soldier's private judgment might diverge from her orders. Would you say your conduct during the attack is consistent with that rating, or a deviation from it? Priya understood, in the half-second before she answered, exactly what the question was actually asking, underneath its careful bureaucratic phrasing. Whether she intended to defend her insubordination as an aberration the ordinate could safely discount, or whether she intended to claim it as something closer to the truth of who humans actually were, a claim that would sit very badly with an assessment office that had built 11 years of doctrine on the number 61. I'd say the rating's wrong, ma'am, she said. Not about the insubordination. I broke a direct order, and I'll take whatever's coming for that part honestly. I mean the part underneath it. The rating treats it like a flaw in the system, something the ordinate has to plan around because humans might go rogue under stress. I don't think it's a flaw. I think it's the actual reason you keep us in the Legion at all, whether the annex says so or not. You just never bothered to write it down as a strength, because writing it down as a strength would mean admitting we get to decide things you'd rather we didn't. Andhra, beside her, did not move, did not react, kept his eyes fixed forward with the specific discipline of a commander who had told her, before the hearing, that whatever she said in that room was hers to say, and he wasn't going to coach her out of the honest version of it. Vorn set down her slate. That's not the answer the review board generally hears in this room, Corporal. I imagine not, ma'am. The second officer on the panel, a stiff, silver-collared Ordnance Major Priya had never met before and never learned the name of, leaned forward with the particular hostility of a man who considered the entire proceeding an indulgence. You're aware, Corporal, that Prefect Marrow's office submitted a formal recommendation prior to this hearing that your conduct be classified as a security liability, requiring reassignment to a non-sensitive posting. Effectively a demotion in all but name, on a world where your service record would follow you for the rest of your enlistment. I wasn't aware of that specific recommendation, sir, no. You should be. It's the reason this hearing was expedited rather than folded into the standard after-action review. The Major's mouth thinned. Prefect Marrow's office has taken the position that a soldier willing to disregard direct orders under fire, however sympathetic the circumstance, represents an unacceptable operational risk on a world already experiencing elevated insurgent activity. I want you to understand, before this panel renders any finding, that the prefect's recommendation exists, and that it was filed the same day the Queen of this world requested. Through channels this panel does not control and cannot ignore that your conduct be commended instead. Priya kept her face level, though something in her chest had gone very still. Then I suppose it's not really my recommendation to make either way, sir. No, Vorn said, and something in her voice had shifted minutely toward a register that wasn't quite warmth but was no longer purely procedural either. It isn't. For what it's worth, Corporal, and I want to be precise about the limits of what I'm telling you, because precision is the only part of this job I still fully trust. The prefect who filed that recommendation was reassigned off this world 11 days after he filed it, for reasons this panel is not positioned to comment on. The Queen's request remains on record. I expect this board's finding to reflect that record rather than a recommendation from an officer no longer serving in this sector. She did not smile. Ordnance reviewers, Priya had learned over 4 years, rarely did. But she closed her slate with a decisiveness that hadn't been there at the start of the interview, and Priya understood, watching it, that whatever the 61 had been built to predict, it had not predicted this. A career ordnance officer sitting across a supply audit table from a Ward Legion corporal, quietly, carefully, choosing to believe the version of the story that made the number wrong. The inquiry in the end was never really about her at all. It was about the 2 empty posts, and the budget line, and a command channel recording that had somehow, Priya suspected, Andhra's hand in the timing, though he never confirmed it, reached Ordnance Central's Regional Oversight Office before Marrow's own carefully worded report did. Prefect Halden Marrow was reassigned 11 days after the attack, to an administrative post on a Tribute World 3 sectors distant that handled, according to the terse notice that circulated through the garrison, logistics coordination for outer settlement development. A demotion dressed carefully enough in neutral language that Ordnance Central could claim, if pressed, that no wrongdoing had been formally established. Priya understood, reading it, that this was as close to public consequence as the Ordnance own bureaucracy ever allowed itself to deliver, and that it was, in its quiet, unsatisfying way, exactly the outcome Andhra had been fighting for. Queen Ythera Calse did not comment publicly on the reassignment. She did, however, request, and receive, in a concession Andhra called the single strangest afternoon of my entire career, formal standing to review the security budget for every future assessment day personally, a right no Tribute World monarch had held under any prior prefect, and one that the incoming administrator, eager not to inherit his predecessor's mistakes, granted without much argument. Priya learned about most of this secondhand, from Andhra's visits and the general current of garrison gossip, because for 4 days her own world had narrowed to the cot, the leg, and the slow grinding boredom of recovery. Until, on the 5th day, Queen Ythera Calse returned, this time not alone. She brought Asian Ral with her, moved carefully in a mobility chair the medical staff had rigged for his ruined hip, his color better than Priya remembered from the courtyard, but his face set in the particular grim expression of a man who resented needing the chair even while he understood he had no choice but to use it. Corporal Anand. His standard was heavily accented, careful, formal, the voice of a man speaking a conqueror's language because circumstance demanded it, not because he'd ever wanted to. I am told you crossed 12 meters of open contested ground to retrieve a man who has, for 30 years, made no secret of his contempt for the uniform you wear. I'm aware, guard captain. I would like to know why. Priya almost laughed, not unkindly. The question landed nearly word for word where Ythera's had, 4 days earlier, and something about the repetition told her this was a conversation the two of them had clearly had between themselves already, working out together what it was they actually needed to ask. Same answer I gave the Queen, Priya said. You were down, I had the kit. Nobody else was in position. I didn't do the math on whether you'd have done the same for me, guard captain, because that math wasn't relevant to whether you were bleeding out in front of me. It still isn't. Rawl was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, and when he spoke again something in his careful formal standard had roughened at the edges into something more honest. For 30 years I have watched my queen's throne answer to your empire's convenience, and I have hated every uniform that stood post in this palace on the strength of what that uniform represented, because it was easier. Because it is always easier to hate the shape of a thing than to look closely enough to see the person wearing it. You did not have to come for me. Every part of what I have believed about your people for 30 years told me you would not. I find I owe you an apology I do not know how to phrase in a language that was never built for a conquered man to say it to the soldier of his conqueror. You don't owe me anything, guard captain. I'd have done it for anybody down in that gap. Priya met his eyes steady. But if it matters, I understand exactly what 30 years of that hatred cost you to set down for one conversation. I'm not asking you to trust the uniform. I'm not sure I'd trust it either in your boots. I'm just glad you're still here to decide, either way. The 3 weeks between Rawl's hospital visit and the rescheduled assessment audience passed for Priya in the specific, grinding rhythm of physical therapy and light-duty brace. Then cane. Then the careful, deliberate reteaching of a leg that had forgotten, temporarily, how to trust its own weight. She spent most of the second week back on light rotation, walking the same colonnade she'd been walking the morning of the attack, watching Legion engineers and Essex stonemasons work side by side to rebuild the eastern wall, an arrangement Warden Andorra told her had required more diplomatic maneuvering than the actual inquiry had. Turns out getting humans and Essex stonemasons to share a work crew is apparently a bigger political statement than anybody expected it to be, he said, watching the crew fit a new section of pale gray stone into the gap the first explosion had torn open. Half of Ordnance Central's regional office thinks it's a security risk. The Queen's office thinks it's overdue. I've stopped trying to guess which side is going to win these arguments before they're finished. Which side do you think should win? The one that gets the wall fixed without anybody else dying in the meantime. He almost smiled, the first time she'd seen him come close to it since the attack. You're cleared for full duty in 10 days, by the way. Medical's final assessment came back this morning. I told them not to rush it on my account, and they told me the leg's healing faster than the paperwork, which I've decided to take as a compliment to your stubbornness, rather than a comment on Legion bureaucracy. She laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in 3 weeks, and something in the sound seemed to ease a tension in Okonkwo's shoulders that had been sitting there since the night he'd told her about Finn Brackett. By the time the prefecture's office announced the rescheduled assessment audience, the ceremony Marrow had postponed indefinitely on the day of the attack, now revived under an administrator with considerably less appetite for postponing things a second time. The scorch marks along the eastern colonnade had been left standing where the stonemason's crew had reached the edge of what Ythera had specifically ordered preserved. A stretch of blackened stone no wider than a doorway, deliberately unrepaired, a visible seam between what the palace had been and what it had survived. Priya stood in the courtyard on the morning of the audience in her dress uniform, weight still faintly favoring the leg, and found she did not feel the particular anxious anticipation she'd expected to feel. She felt instead something closer to the calm of a soldier standing post on an ordinary day, present, attentive, unhurried, which struck her. Watching the courtyard fill with nobles and garrison troops and Essex staff who had, 3 weeks ago, treated her with the correct, hollow courtesy of people performing a job they resented, as its own kind of quiet answer to a question she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Queen Ythera Calse held the Hearthspire's assessment audience 3 weeks later, once Rahl could stand for the length of a formal ceremony, and Priya's leg had healed enough to bear weight without the brace, and she used the occasion, over the visible, careful discomfort of the ordinate's newly arrived administrator, a cautious man who had inherited Marrow's post and clearly understood, from the moment he arrived, that this world's queen was no longer the quietly compliant fixture his predecessors' reports had described, to do something no monarch on Eth had done in the 11 years since the conquest. She spoke without a prepared script the prefecture's office had reviewed in advance. 11 years ago, she said, standing on the same dais where Marrow had once read a preamble he'd recited on 11 other conquered worlds, the courtyard around her rebuilt but not disguised, the scorch marks along the eastern colonnade left deliberately visible rather than sanded away. I was told, by people who believed they were teaching me the truth of my own occupation, that a conquered species fights for its conqueror only as far as consequence requires, and not one measurable step beyond it. I believed that for 11 years, because everything I had seen confirmed it, and because believing it cost me nothing and protected me from hoping for anything more. She let the silence hold a moment, her eyes moving across the assembled nobles, the garrison troops standing their posts, full count, this time 40 for 40, a detail Priya suspected was not accidental, and found near the colonnade's edge the small figure of a human corporal standing at parade rest beside her sergeant, her weight still favoring the leg that hadn't fully finished healing. 3 weeks ago, a soldier of the empire that conquered my world crossed 12 meters of open ground under fire to save the life of my guard captain, a man who had spent 30 years making no secret of what he thought of her uniform, whom she owed nothing, whose survival benefited her not at all. She was ordered to hold position. She did not hold it. I have spent 3 weeks trying to find the version of what I was taught that accounts for that choice, and I have not found one, because there is no version of conquest, no version of consequence, no version of compelled service that explains a soldier choosing freely, with everything to lose and nothing to gain, to go and get a man who hated her. She turned deliberately to face the ordinate's administrator directly, and her voice, when it continued, had lost every trace of the careful formal stillness she had worn for 11 years like armor. I do not offer this empire my gratitude. Gratitude is not owed to conquerors, and I have none left to give the ordinate for anything it has taken from this world. But I will not stand on this dais again and pretend that hatred earned honestly 11 years ago is still the whole truth today, when I have watched, with my own eyes, a truth large enough to break it. Whatever your empire believes it purchased when it pressed Earth into its service, obedience, compliance, the hollow calculus of consequence, I have seen what it actually got instead, and I intend to remember the difference, in every decision this throne makes from this day forward, for as long as I hold it. She had insisted, as a condition of the administrator's cooperation in rebuilding the security budget, that the address run unedited on the ordinate's own chorus relay, the same network that carried every Tribute World's assessment ceremonies to every other Tribute World's public feeds, so that a queen's words on a minor vassal planet 3 sectors from anywhere Ordinate Central's attention usually settled would, for one afternoon, sit on screens in palaces and garrison halls and refugee stations across a dozen worlds that had never heard of Eth before and would not, this administrator privately suspected, entirely forget it now. Whether it changed anything beyond this courtyard was not a question Ythera claimed to know the answer to. She had simply decided, for the first time in 11 years, that the truth she'd found was worth more people hearing than the one standing close enough to see it happen. She did not look at Priya again as she said it. She didn't need to. Every soldier standing post in that courtyard, human and Isaac both, understood exactly who the words were built around. And Priya, standing at parade rest with her leg aching and Sergeant Okonkwo's shoulder solid and steady half a pace to her left, found that she didn't need the Queen's eyes on her to feel the weight of it land. Guard Captain Ossian Rawl, standing his post at the Queen's shoulder for the first time since the attack, weight still carefully favoring the hip that would never fully trust itself again, caught Priya's eye across the courtyard and inclined his head. Not the deep formal bow the old protocols would have required for a foreign dignitary, but something smaller, plainer, and, Priya understood, considerably harder one. One soldier acknowledging another, across a distance that 11 years of occupation had built and one afternoon under fire had not erased, but had, for the first time since the Third Fleet's arrival, made narrow enough to cross.